Anyone who has spent a significant amount of time around me or around this channel will know the kind of connotation and the kind of importance to me personally that these three letters of MTT have. Because of course they are the makers of my favourite vehicle of all time, the Y2K Turbine Superbike. They've also made others, even faster ones, but the original year 2000 shape, which is very appropriately named the Y2K, is still my favourite because of its original purity. It was the one that did it first, put simply. And although it's a bike which is easy to forget how good it is or how fast it is, or to think of stuff like the SSC Ultimate Aero, or the Hennessy Venom GT, or the Bugatti Chiron, or even the fastest car in the world, the Koenigsegg Agera RS, it's easy to think of the bike as being probably slower than those by this point, these 15, 16, 1700 horsepower cars, stuff like the SSC Tuatara, or the forthcoming Hennessy Venom F5 for instance. But suffice it to say, this company has a strong track record when it comes to making fast vehicles. They don't make supercars or superbikes left, right and centre, but when they do, they really do. They make some incredible vehicles. Now the Y2K, as an example, can get to 227 miles per hour quicker than it takes a Veyron to get to 180. The fastest accelerating car in the world is still, for the moment, the Hennessy Venom GT, which does 0 to 200 in about 14. This does 227 in 15. So with that kind of track record going on the bike side of things, what would happen if MTT turned their attention instead to a car? And this is where it gets interesting, because a lot of people, even those who are aware of the Y2K, which is their crowning achievement, are not necessarily aware that they have made cars as well. In fact, there are two in particular. The first one that they built was based on a classic style Chevy truck, which has two huge exhaust outlets coming out the top. It can spit flames. It's kind of a show truck, if you will, not necessarily designed for full-on performance, although it's certainly no slouch. This one, though, is very much so designed to be used, and it is of course based on a Mini. Now this car was commissioned by a businessman by the name of Bob Schwartz, and it was in the height of modern new Mini craze, the Mini fever era of the, say, early to mid 2000s, and this car was of course a Mini Cooper S. That's what it started out as, a 1.6 engine, front-wheel drive, but then Bob Schwartz asked MTT to retrofit it with what they do best, a gas turbine. So in a very similar way to the last episode of Unsung Heroes, where we looked at the similarly named MTM Bimoto Audi with two engines making an extreme machine for sure, this one takes a very similar route. But the difference is this one can change between a front-engine front-wheel drive car, a rear-engine rear-wheel drive car, and a dual-engine all-wheel drive car at any given moment, based entirely on what you want from it, because they did not remove the standard Cooper engine. You've still got that and you can still use it just as you would normally. But at the back end, they made some pretty radical changes, as you would assume you would. Now from the outside, the only visual cues really are the air intake on the top, accompanied by what you might not initially see or recognise as two large exhaust outlets. Now when you're actually driving the car, it's pretty obvious, because it's a distinctive sound, to say the least. But in terms of what they actually did to this Mini, the back seats are completely removed, so no surprise there. It's not exactly the most practical Mini in the world, but instead of those rear seats, they fitted an Allison series, which is from Rolls-Royce, 250 C20B turbine. Now that puts out more power than the Y2K bike did, 420 horsepower and 600 pound-feet of torque. Now in a Mini, that's pretty crazy, and of course the rear axle of a Mini was not designed ever to take that kind of load or even to put down that kind of power. So what they did is retrofitted it with the rear axle and the suspension from a Corvette, a C5 Corvette, which is interesting that you could actually fit that into a Mini in the first place, but they managed to do that. It's also fitted with a custom fuel tank, a firewall between the engine and the passengers, and a plexiglass window as well. So suffice it to say that it has, you could say, a much more exciting rear view through the mirror than most Minis do. Instead of seeing whatever's behind you, you can see a turbine engine, which for me personally is a pretty cool concept. What then in terms of performance? Because as I said, you can run it with whatever the power of that car was at the time, around 160, 170 horsepower on the front axle. You can run 420 through the back, or you can combine them both to get that little bit of an extra boost off the line with the front end. So how quick is this? especially given the crazy performance of the Y2K, which, as I learned this morning, if this is correct, apparently can hit 200 in 6.1 seconds. I already knew, as I said, that it could do 227 in 15, so those numbers seem a bit incongruent, but either way, it's the fastest thing ever, pretty much, as far as drivable or rideable vehicles. This one isn't that quick, but of course not. It's a much heavier vehicle, it's much less aerodynamic, it's a Mini, which is like a brick compared to the bike in terms of aerodynamics, but it's still a Mini with a turbine engine, so it ain't going to be slow. And it's not slow. In fact, on one of the first runs that the owner ever did in the car, he managed to run around a 12-second quarter mile. And the main issue with running this vehicle, especially with both engines engaged, is trying to use them in the most effective way. Because, of course, putting all of the power and torque down, even of a relatively modest Mini Cooper, can still result in wheel spin anyway and a little bit of torque steer. So trying to get that optimum launch, especially with a gas turbine which is naturally sluggish at low speeds as well, it's understandable why that would be tricky. Apparently, however, this car can run 11-second quarter miles at about 120 miles per hour, and it's one of the only vehicles ever which you can legitimately say can run on both petrol and diesel at any given moment, which I personally think is pretty cool as well. Now, in terms of actual 0 to 60 times, he was initially able to run it at about 4.3 seconds to 60, which is already a lot faster than a Mini Cooper would usually be, but now apparently with those 11-second quarter mile times, you're looking at about 3.5 seconds to 60. So as far as Minis go, it's definitely one of the fastest in the world, and the difference between this Mini and many other quick ones like Time Attack Minis or rally-bred ones, which can hit 60 in a similar amount of time, especially if you're talking like rallycross mods or hill climb cars, the difference is, because it has that turbine as well, it's not just fast to 60, because the thing about a turbine is the faster you go, the more efficient it becomes. And although that, of course, does have an upper limit, it's not just endless, it does mean that the top end and even mid-range acceleration is significantly quicker than any other Mini would have, even with a similar amount of power. 420 horsepower from the turbine alone doesn't necessarily sound that impressive when you put it into a car. That's a similar amount of power to what an Audi RS4 would have had from a similar time period. But, of course, because of the way the turbine works, in a similar way to like a Mazda rotary, the performance that you get from those numbers far exceeds it. Especially, of course, when the torque delivery of 600 pound-feet from as low as 6,000 RPM in an engine that redlines at 60,000 RPM, you've got plenty of thrust at any given time. So it's certainly not the most practical of vehicles around. You can burn through the whole diesel tank in about half an hour. So, as I said, not practical at all, but it's essentially the closest thing that a Mini could ever get to being an actual supercar. So overall, although for me personally it's nowhere near as enticing as their motorbike, of course a ground-up creation will always be more enticing than a custom car as far as I'm concerned, it still goes to show the kind of performance that a turbine can give you, even when it's put into a vehicle that isn't ideal for it. A Mini is one of the last things you'd probably want to put that kind of engine in terms of seeing what it can do, but it still showed the incredible potential of putting a turbine into a car, not just a bike. And overall, I think it's definitely a vehicle that deserves more attention because it is definitely overshadowed by its motorbike brother. But overall, I love the company. This is yet another reason why I do, and it's certainly a car that deserves to be talked about more because it's crazy and it's fast, and it's certainly alternative. But that's it for this pick overall. Of course, you can click through here on screen to see all of the previous episodes, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.